Chapter 20 of Psychopomp Drive. Written by Janeen Leese-Taylor. Read aloud by Skaya Simaru. Chapter 20. No one else to turn to. Finley crossed from one roof to the next carefully, holding Thorn's legs in place around his waist. Her arms encircled his neck like a vice as she held back her terrified screams, burying her head into the side of his neck to muffle the sound. She had never been a fan of heights, even at the best of times, and jumping through the sky like this felt insane, if not completely unnatural. He chuckled as he felt her pull her body closer to his with a restrained squeak. "You all right down there?" he asked her. "Oh yeah, totally freaking lush!" she answered sarcastically. "You get used to it after a while," Finley quipped, amused by her familiar Welsh slang. "The idea that you're just able to do this now is mind-boggling to me," she commented, and he heard her sharp intake of breath as they leapt across another gap and raced down the side of a building. Finley wasn't sure how the concealment spell would work when he had a living person with him, so he was careful to stay out of sight of those getting ready to head to work. It was just past 7:30 a.m., and the floods of people that were leaving the city center was more than he had been used to. The warm morning sunshine filtered through the trees overhead, casting unique green-tinged shadows along the cobblestones. The air was balmy with springtime heat, drawing the last evidence of the rain from the old stone. Shutters rose around them from electronic locks, rattling like an old man rising from a chair. Finley's tall ears took in every sound, assessed every risk as they traveled. He would avoid their prying eyes as best he could, and hope that the passing glimpse of a cat spirit would be chalked up to last night's wine. When they reached a familiar road, lined with rowdy English pubs and long-closed charity shops, Finley crouched and slowly pried apart Thorn's grip, bringing her up with him again as he straightened. Gray birds danced along the edges of the nearby pigeon box, hooting and cooing in conversation. A red crisp packet rolled past like a tumbleweed, like nothing was out of the ordinary. She looked around the quiet car park with a frown. You brought me home," she noted. "It's the safest place for you right now," he answered her, hopping down the 2 large steps that led to what was once their shared home. "It's not a heavily populated area. The destroyer won't come through this way." Snuggled in against slowly rousing charity shops, a tattoo parlor, and a series of takeaways, the usually boisterous bars had finally settled back to sleep for the day. Only cleaners, with the hum of their hoovers and the low buzz of music in their headphones, were awake at this hour. Further down the street, a man had just rolled his large metal cart out for the day. Banners and flags hung from every side, strange exotic plush creatures dangling weightlessly from the front, swaying in the wind. Thorn watched Finley as he walked across the crinkling stones to their front door. waiting for her to join him. When he looked up at her, her teal eyes were sparkling with sunrise hues of pink and gold. "I never thought I would see this again," she whispered, running her fingers along the arm of her jacket. He tilted his head. "See what?" "You. Home. Like this," she answered, crossing the shifting, gray-toned pebbles with a sad smile. She reached out to brush his arm with her fingertips, studying him like he might disappear any moment. "I always thought the last time would be the last time." "It was supposed to be," he replied softly, meeting her eyes. He had forgotten just how beautiful her eyes were, how they changed colors from blue to green in the streaks of sunlight. Her eyes had always been expressive, a true representation of the windows to her soul. Even at times when he wasn't sure what she was thinking, her eyes would always keep him on the right path. "Want to see something cool?" he asked her. Those familiar eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Always." He raised a hand towards the door, and purple light streamed along his arm and into his fingertips. With a quiet click, the heavy wooden door swung inwards. He twisted to grin at her playfully. "I've got mad skills now," he teased, wriggling his dark eyebrows. Thorne's smile was like that of a child being taken to a chocolate factory, and she snorted, burying the bottom half of her face behind a hand. "Oh, I need you to teach me that." She twirled as she stepped past him and into the small opening, unlocking the glass door inside with a twinkling of keys. Inside was just as Finley remembered it, and he felt emotion swirl within him at the sight. Warm shades of yellow and bold navy greeted them from the kitchen and living room areas, a collection of wooden animals occupying every available surface. Fresh yellow roses rested in a vase on the white counter coffee table. They were surrounded by cards that Thorne had failed to take down yet. Sympathy cards, he realized, reaching out to lift the one nearest to him. It was from her friends at the Red, White, and Brew, and listed their names and their well wishes inside, alongside drawings of hearts and smiling faces. Noticing the card in his hand, Thorne let out a quiet sigh. "The ones in work were really nice about it," she commented. "I had Greg around here every other day, checking in on me, making sure I ate." "I wish that I could thank him," Finley said, and laid the card back on top of the table carefully. "It must have been awful." She turned her eyes away from him, her voice growing small. "It was," she agreed. The air felt like it was pulled from the room, the atmosphere as cold as the vacuum of space. He reached out a hand towards her, to comfort, to reassure, but he fell short on finding the right words. Instead, it was a soft mule that pulled her attention, and she bent down to scoop her cat, Poppy, into her arms. The small brown animal peered up at him as the man reached out to stroke the space between her ears. The cat nudged against his fingers affectionately, her purrs as loud as a motor starting on a cold winter's morning. "I missed you, too," he replied softly. "Both of you. I passed by the coffee shop any chance I could." She turned to look at him in surprise. There were still tears in the corners of her bright eyes. "You came by?" The corner of his mouth turned slightly upwards as Poppy hopped down to walk along the back of the sofa, brushing against his dark uniform. "I couldn't get too close, but I was there." Her eyes widened in realization. "You were the one who left the broken stem." His own smile widened by a few molars. "You saw it?" She nodded, coming closer and tracing her fingertips along the back of the gray fabric sofa in the center of the room. "I thought maybe someone had caught the rose head in the door or something, but then there was no sign of it." She laughed quietly to herself. "I thought I was crazy for thinking it was a sign." Finley ran his hand along the back of the sofa until his fingers met hers. He intertwined their digits, feeling the lingering warmth of her skin. "There were so many times I wanted to speak to you." She glanced down at their connecting hands. "Why didn't you?" He exhaled a puff of air from his nose. "When I joined the Amarini, that's the guys who gave me these cool ears, by the way, I had to sign a contract. All this?" He raised his head and nodded back towards their kitchen. "I'm breaking all of our rules just by being here with you." "This just sounds insane to me," Thorne whispered. "And all this time, you've been right there." She frowned down at the point where their hands were joined, clearly frustrated with herself. "How could I not have known that?" "Pretty sure none of the religions guessed this was an option," he said, waving his free hand to point at his new ears. "Besides, you were never supposed to know. It's part of the deal that brought me back." She raised her head again. "Then what changed?" He exhaled another soft sigh. "Nothing changed, Thorne. I just didn't know what else to do," he answered her honestly. "Once I saw you back there, I couldn't just leave you. That thing, the destroyer, it's super dangerous. We don't even fully know what it is." "You don't know what it is?" she repeated incredulously. He shook his head. Today at the zoo was just the beginning. This thing is going to get a whole lot worse unless we can find a way to stop it." He could see the fear in her expression as she brought her bottom lip into her mouth and chewed on it. He finally closed the distance between them, running a hand through her hair in a motion he knew would soothe her. "I couldn't risk you getting caught in the crossfire," he whispered as he pressed a kiss into the top of her head. She hummed as she leaned against his weight. His body felt totally different than it did before. Less warm, more solid. She gripped tightly to his shirt, grounding herself. "What about all those other people out there, Finn? This isn't just going to affect me. All of England is going to be in danger." "I know," he said. "I know. We've just got to think of something else. A new plan." He pulled himself back from her. "One that keeps everyone we love out of harm's way." He leaned his forehead against hers, breathing in the familiar scent of citrus and coffee beans from her shirt.
"And I think I know just the person to help."
Reichardt raised his head at the knock on his door, muttering a quiet,
"It's open,"
as he placed a cardboard marker into its resting place in the old, well-worn book. When Finley entered, the man rose and placed the tome back on the shelf, crossing the room towards him in a few long strides.
"Finley!"
he elated, taking hold of the man's upper arms.
"We were worried when you didn't arrive back with the rest of the group."
He began looking him over, picking at the tears in his uniform.
"Are you all right? Are you hurt?"
There were cuts across his skin, darkened areas where bruises were beginning to form. He looked like he hadn't slept, his pale skin almost translucent. Finley shook his head.
"Reich, I need your help."
That was a surprise. The taller Amarini scanned his face with questioning blue eyes.
"What is this about, Finn?"
A flush of red passed across the smaller man's face, moving to his neck and ears. Something like shame or embarrassment flitted across his face.
I did something, Finn."
Reichardt's tone grew slightly harder, probing.
"What did you do?" "It'll make more sense if I show you,"
Finley answered. He reached for the door behind him and pulled it open, and Reichardt followed him out into the corridor, watching as the other man led him down the stairs and towards the front door.
"Where are you going?"
his companion questioned.
"Outside. Please, just trust me, all right? I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important."
The usually sleepy buildings around them in the cul-de-sac were wide awake when they climbed out from the darkness of Psychopomp Drive. There were no gentle lights peeking out from inside, no shadows passing as their occupants settled in front of the bright blue ambiance of television screens. Curtains were thrown wide. Cars were missing from driveways. Further down the street, Reichardt could hear the sound of a lawnmower running, and children in the school's chalk-dusted playground. He wasn't used to being awake at this hour. It had been a great many years since he had seen the sun at such a high point in the sky. Behind them, the water feature folded back into itself, like a game of dominoes being played in reverse. The water dried up, spinning down to rejoin the river inside, returning the fountain to its typical disused appearance. Finley pulled up his hood as he felt the beginnings of rain on his face.
"It isn't far,"
he assured the other spirit.
"Then lead the way,"
Reichardt answered with a nod, pulling up his own hood. A sense of dread fell over him as he allowed the young Amarini to lead him across the rooftops and back into the city. He had never seen him behave this way. He was racing from building to building with a single-minded focus, his ears pointed up and alert through the small gaps in his hood. Reichardt vaguely registered the feeling of cold water splashing up the sides of his trousers, the cool wind blowing through the slowly filling streets, but they were like background noise. They made their way past the Grand Grosvenor Hotel and took a left, past the old black and white building that served as a bank, past the street vendors and the council workers that were watering the plants. When they dropped down to ground level again, it was in a vacant car park next to a row of swings and sun-warmed tarmac. Reichardt frowned as he eyed the ornate building next to them. Black and white on the outside, it was a traditional Chester dwelling that had once served as an old schoolhouse. It was freshly painted and lined with bright red flowers. The garden was crafted with organized wildness, a small alcove hiding chairs away from the rest of the world. The trees and plants around it were lush and green and vibrant with life. From inside, a warm glow peeked out from the original windows, and something else moved around. Finley grasped the door handle and twisted it, pushing inside without hesitation. He held the door ajar like an invitation, and Reichardt reached for it cautiously, holding it open as he joined him. It had been a great many years since he had ventured inside a building other than those in Psychopomp Drive. This home felt lived in, as colorful and breathing as the woman standing in front of him. Everything ached with a mixture of joyful existence and painful loss. There were dishes in the sink from when the owner had had company. Condolence cards and flowers settled at the center point of the room, alongside a half-finished mug of coffee. Pictures of the woman and a still-living Finley Evans lined the side of the lukewarm ceramic, and Reichardt turned to the younger man with a questioning expression.
Before you say anything, Finley began, I realize that this is a really bad idea.
He stepped back so that he was standing next to the stranger, reaching out to take her hand in his. Reichardt's ears twisted like satellites on top of his black gelled hair, questioning. It only took him a single moment to recognize the person standing in front of him. Her skin was dark, dotted with paler areas of freckles along her nose and eyes. Under navy blots of mascara and eyeshadow, her eyes were bright and blue. Her hair was pinned up into two messy buns, like she had cat ears of her own. Made up of wild curls of brown and pink, it cascaded around her shoulders and upper back like the great tendrils of an attractive spring plant.
Rules Daniels, I presume.
Reichardt's voice shattered the spell between them, and the first Amarini materialized as if from a clear haze. The woman's eyes widened with wonder, and she tried her best to contain her small gasp. Reichardt's eyes drew a harsh line from their guest to the other spirit in the room.
Finley's partner, yes?
Finley nodded.
She was volunteering at the zoo whenever the destroyer attacked.
Reichardt sighed and reached up a hand to remove his glasses, using the other one to massage the area around his temples.
You do realize that you have just made both you and I break the terms of our contract.
Finley's dark ears were plastered to the side of his head.
I know, Reich. Believe me, I know. But that thing was out there, and I couldn't... Are you insane?
The man interrupted with a growl, replacing his frames on his nose.
There is a reason that the dead are forbidden from addressing the living, Finn.
He threw up his hands in a rare show of anger.
And have you forgotten what happens to those who break their contract? I am assuming that Saulo does not know yet.
His companion shook his head, his voice growing small and quiet.
You're the only one who knows, Reich.
The taller Reichardt's usually calm facade fell away as he roughly trailed a hand across his jaw and mouth.
This isn't good, Finn.
His blue eyes turned towards the woman next to them, watching the multitude of emotions that were taking up residence on her face.
I am sorry. I know this must sound rather callous of me, but it isn't safe for a living soul to be near those from the in-between. The magic, it reacts differently to a living soul than to a dead one. Our rules are in place for a reason.
She gave him a small, consolatory smile. I'm not going to pretend I understand what's going on, she replied. All of this, it just seems impossible to me. She shrugged. I assume I'm currently lying unconscious somewhere, getting my leg chewed off by a tiger, honestly. Reichardt let out a snort of amusement.
I assure you, as bizarre as all of this is, it is most certainly real. The destroyer was intentionally targeting those people out there, Reich.
Finley continued, shuffling closer to his living partner.
The Reapers could only do so much. We need more magic, more power in order to fight this thing.
She was definitely sentient, Thorn added uncertainly. She was playing with us, like a cat with a mouse. Her brows furrowed. She liked that I was angry. She was encouraging me to, I don't know, fight back, get violent or something.
That is concerning,
Reichardt remarked thoughtfully. Thorn and Finley exchanged a look. So, what does that mean for us? The living human asked. What can we do to stop it? The first Amorini glanced between the couple in the room with a frown.
It means that your knowledge of the in-between is the least of our worries right now.
The fountain unfolded before them like a child's pop-up book, the edges folding neatly to create new shapes. As always, Finley stepped back to allow the tiles to form along the ground before he headed for the steps. Around them, spirits bustled back and forth at a frantic pace, doorways opening and closing to either side of them. Lost souls lined the side of the cavern with a faraway look in their eyes, as a cloaked figure helped them clamber into the wooden boat. As they boarded, they opened their mouths and lifted a coin from their tongue, passing it across to the ferryman.
"Evening, Caron,"
Reichardt greeted as they passed, Finley falling in behind the other Amorini. The cloaked figure twisted towards them to reveal a skeletal form beneath the fabric with blue-gray bones and a tusked mouth like a wild boar. He pocketed his offering and then raised a hand in response.
"Good evening, Amorini of Saulo. I was so very sorry to hear the news of your companion. Just dreadful."
Reichardt froze in place, glancing back at the ferryman.
Compagnon?
The eye sockets of the spirit dipped downwards at the edges, like eyebrows might, forming an expression of dismay.
"You hadn't heard, then?"
The god grunted. Finley came to a stop by Reichardt's right shoulder.
I haven't heard what, Charon?
The skeletal creature turned his face away, his long beard twisting in the cold wind, coming off the river to his left.
Apologies, it is not my place to say. We must return to Salo,
Rykard urged him, and Finley followed after the man's retreating form. He rushed through the cavern towards the corner that housed their own door, reaching towards it fearfully. Finley felt the icy chill of the evening air melt away as he stepped into the warmth of their inner sanctum. The pair were breathless by the time they entered the makeshift home, and they surveyed the faces around them with wild, frantic eyes. Micah was curled up on one of the armchairs, draped in a dark-colored coat. Her hands were wrapped around the hilt of a sword, which flared with purple light as she rocked it like one might see a mother calming a distraught infant. Her eyes were closed, but leaking tears as she hummed, her rhythm disjointed by the interruptions of her emotional hiccups. At the table, Scrappy stared off into space, a crumpled-up shirt tightly wound around one hand. The NB sniffed, but didn't look up when the others entered. Spectre stood behind them, drawing soothing patterns on their back with one hand. His lips were moving, but his words were too quiet to hear from across the room. Rykard's head turned as he took in the expressions on his companions.
Salo!
His tone was questioning, searching. The cat let out a sigh and raised his head. His usually bright galaxy eyes faded to a dull sheen.
Rykard,
he acknowledged, ears drooping down on either side of his head as he approached the man. The first Amarini counted the people around them in his head.
Salo, where is John Anderson?
He asked. Micah whimpered in her armchair, clutching the weapon tightly against her chest. Spectre looked up and shook his head slowly, his hand never leaving the shaking form of Scrappy beneath him.
We received news about a second attack in Grosvenor Park earlier this afternoon,
Salo said from his spot on the kitchen table. His silky tail, usually animated with his thoughts, lay limp by his side.
We dispatched 2 new teams of Amarini to assist in rescue efforts, but...
Finley knew what was coming before the words even left the feline's mouth. He swallowed and turned his head to see a flash of anger and disbelief on Rykard's face. The expression was gone as quickly as it had appeared.
"Where is States?"
Rykard repeated coolly, his voice low like the first wave of an impending tsunami. From her armchair, Micah began to shake her head, her hummed song growing louder as if to drown out the words that followed.
"He's gone, Rykard," the Grim answered. "I'm so sorry, but the Amarini known as John Anderson no longer exists."
To be continued in Chapter 21.